Hello, 103 gang. Um, I want to try to set up some little small videos to get more of them to you because I keep having all these ideas that I would just have piled up in my head and then I would get out during class. Sometimes I don't get them quickly onto some video, and this whole time I've been worried about typing too much. I know some teachers that have just simply decided that they're going to produce everything in written form, and then the students are going to read and do their assignments, and I'm not so thrilled about that. I know I always hated it if a teacher made us buy the book, made us read the book, and then we'd go into class, and that's the only thing he would do is say the same thing that's already in the book. So I'm trying to balance some things out, and later I'm going to ask, what should I do more of, what should I do less, because I don't have a lot of confidence in any one of these particular things, right? I know why I'm doing them. I just don't know the reception, especially considering that my students didn't sign up for an online class, so most of them haven't been thinking in that direction, right? But anyways, I also realized I got a chance to show off. I don't usually get to bring my t-shirts, my message t-shirts, right? But I got this one out in the desert. So Homeland Security fighting terrorism since 1492. And I'm almost positive that's Geronimo's squad. I think that's the famous photo of him. So I got these different kinds of shirts I never get to show, right? But a couple little things I wanted to say about the 103 paper. Now, I threw out a long page today, something like an essay, so you guys can look at. And, I do some goofing around in there, but it's a pretty serious thing because I know from having graded these essays about 21st century thinking that some students it's not catching in their mind what the whole concept of it is, right? And some students get it real quickly, and some students, I think they're just worried about other things, right? The simple concept, I hope, is that if you were trying to solve problems like well, what do we do about this disease that's coming around our countryside, and you were trying to solve that in, was it the 1600s? I saw a church on the news today that had been up and running when the Black Plague came through. So that church had people in it, suffering, dying, praying, all the way back then. And now they're dealing with the same thing again. So that's a pretty, that's a lot of years, but some of the same issues are coming right back, right? Well, if you were back then in those days, what would you do? I had a professor once, and he was an ancient history professor, and he strongly believed that a lot of things written in holy texts around the world were partially by very smart people who knew some important things that the average person didn't know. And so sometimes they said that they got the message directly from God. He just wasn't sure whether that was actually true. In other words, he strongly believed there's so many great things in many of these ancient documents that help people live and survive and thrive, but he just wasn't sure whether he believed in the original source, right? But what he meant was something like, in a time without refrigeration, certain foods are going to be harder to eat and keep, and some foods will turn toxic and kill people. Other foods will sort of turn toxic. You'll take a bite and throw up, and you're going to be okay, right? So he was looking back through these ancient texts because everybody has always had to do with whatever they had at that moment to solve their problems, right? And so if we go back a few hundred years to a plague, we realize that the people, they didn't even have soap for physical suffering. They didn't have aspirin or anything, so they had very limited things, but you still wanted to solve the same problems, like how do we alleviate pain, how do we help the person breathe, with all of this fancy stuff, and the ventilators that everybody's talking about. One interesting thing that came out was that some people in different places around the world knew that flipping a person over to lay on their stomach at a certain time in their difficulties, their deep difficulties with breathing, because what's happening is that you're not getting oxygen with your blood everywhere in your body, right? So they would flip them over on their stomach. But that can be a distressful position, especially for some people, but it might save a person's life at the right time, right? So I'm really happy when I hear that the medical people in this part of the world, the medical people in this county or state are sharing information. Everybody's trying to learn to improve it. I've told my family right since the beginning, what we want to do is not worry about getting it as much as we don't want to get it for as long as possible. Because as people are going through their medical treatment, we're learning things. Plus, we might learn some different kinds of medications that might help, or simply treatments that might help, right? This week, some of the people are talking about whether or not we have been using ventilators in the way that would be best, right? So everybody knows they can be very valuable, but the question is, are we putting maybe the wrong people on at the wrong time? Something like that, right? So anyways, in the 1600s, you would be using a very small number of books. There just, weren't very many books around, not in Christendom. And you would, of course, be using the smartest, most knowledgeable people that were available. Now, one thing that happened back then, and it still sometimes happens today, is sometimes the best healer in the area was a woman who wasn't necessarily, in the fold of the community. So sometimes these are the ones that led to stories about witches and witchcraft. And I knew a woman in college who told me that I think it was her grandmother, but it might have been her mother, was kind of like pushed out of an area town which she lived in because the people basically treated her like she was a witch. And she wasn't extreme in any sort of way, but she did, have many recommendations for people that were, herbal recommendations. I remember she and a friend of hers were talking about things like how to clean your body out, and she wasn't talking about toxins as much as talking about actually getting material out of your body and stuff. And she knew a lot herself, but she said, her ancestor knew so much more, right? But so much that it made people distrust her and uncomfortable, and and she was treated badly for that, right? But it would be nice to think that whoever was back then had their mind open to someone who might have information that's not the most known information, right? There's a nice exchange in an episode of Game of Thrones where Jaime has somebody helping him heal the stump after somebody's cut off his hand, and he's asking the guy, how did you learn to sew up flesh and do what you're doing? And he digs it out of the guy, and the guy had been examining corpses. And I knew the story was probably somewhat inspired by Da Vinci and some of the Renaissance people who obviously studied real corpses to do their drawings and their sculptures and everything else, but it was basically illegal against the church at that time. So we don't know exactly how, but we know that they were procuring these, right? So they weren't as bad as Dr. Frankenstein, and often they were used so that somebody could make a better sculpture, and they would carve because they knew the type of musculature underneath a layer of fat or something, right? And so we still today are impressed by the anatomical knowledge, right, of Da Vinci. Anyways, in the Game of Thrones episode, Jaime is acknowledging that this guy has learned what most of the doctors, well, pretty much all the doctors don't know, because he was studying in a very unconventional way. I remember years ago crying in a very affecting video in which nurses from Russia were working with nurses from America delivering babies. And they were sort of trading off a little, watching how each other did it. And a baby was born, and the Russian nurses swaddled it very tightly and wrapped it very tightly, right? Which, when I had my children, that's one of the things I learned right away. It surprised Americans, but when I was a little kid, we didn't wrap babies real tightly. We thought that was a bad idea, right? Over time, we learned it can be wonderful, right? At the same time, there was the idea when the American nurses delivered their baby that as soon as the baby was born, they held it against the naked chest of the mother, which is very common in American hospitals, right? But the Russian nurses all just broke into tears. They had never seen it. It wasn't part of their protocol. It wasn't normal, but they thought it was wonderful and beautiful. And they weren't really reacting with some of the things we know now about hormones and things that are released inside the mother's body and maybe the baby's body too, I'm not sure, but that there's actually good practical medical, quote-unquote medical reasons for doing that, right? So it's very common now. But that was one group who's thinking inside of a cultural viewpoint, learning from somebody else who was thinking inside of a different cultural viewpoint, right? I think I just thought about that because Julie, one of the students in one of our classes, that's part of her thesis, is to talk about how people, and I don't think we've found the language for this yet. I'm trying to help her find the language, but she's trying to say that people, it's their culture that makes them keep thinking the way they're thinking. And I think where she's going with this, as the language gets refined, is something almost like echo chambers, right? It's the idea that, what you learned, who you grew up talking with, things like that, end up creating sort of your beliefs in a way, right? And so many people, they won't go outside that. They won't even sometimes entertain anything that's outside that. I remember two of my friends, one who went to a different church than I did when I was a kid, and then another friend of mine who went to the church I grew up with. We were talking about dances because we love the fact that Kurt's church actually had dances for with their youth programs and stuff, and as we talked to him, we learned that they were also doing things like they would have members of the youth group sometimes come in after having learned about another religion in the world, and then they would just give a simple presentation. And the idea had nothing to do with something like converting anybody, right? It was the idea to know what others are thinking, and to notice that there's other viewpoints and stuff, right? But I remember my friend Brad and I were thinking, yeah, we don't see the older people at our church thinking that was a good idea. So that idea that you're inside of your own culture, you could also say something like you're inside of your own neighborhood's thinking, right? Or you're inside your own race's thinking or something. If once you recognize that a certain group of people believes in a certain way, there might be some very positive reasons that occurs, but there can also be negative reasons like mob mentality and things, right? So I think that's going to be a good section of Julie's paper when it gets put together, because I think it's a very real thing. Our very modern language lately has talked about things like echo chambers and bubbles. We sometimes use that metaphor, right? Now I jumped away from what I was just saying before. See, that's why I got to do a number of these to try to get these things out to you. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So the paper we're writing right now is number 3. And I'm going to make sure that you have a window in which you can rewrite for grade one paper. And I just, instead of this one, at first I thought I was going to make sure you could rewrite this one because of the disruption and stuff, right? But I think what I've decided is to let you pick whichever one you want, because you may have your own reasons. You may have just really thought the new technology essay just was not interesting, but so just know that. I mean, turn in the best thing you can this week, but know that you'll at least get to change one of them, right? But we also want to talk to each other, because things may come up, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks with jobs. A lot of us have been worried what's going to happen once our own students and professors start getting sick, if they do, because that's going to be a different kind of disruption, right? But just know that we're going to get a shot to rewrite one of those. So if that takes off any pressure, that's good. I'll come back with more commentary and maybe even a new shirt in just a little bit.